So the other thing is, consider changing your opening range and your opening size based on the skill level of your opponents. So, like I said, everything that I've shown you so far is GTO. Uh, but a case could be made for opening wider if the small blind and the big blind are folding too often. The same case could be made for opening wider if they were both calling too often, right? And I'll give you a little thought experiment. Uh, let's say that the small blind and it falls around you on the button. And the small blind and the big blind are going to both fold 80% of the time, right? At that point, you should be opening 100% of hands because you would be long-term profitable even if you never won going post-flop, right? So that would be where you would deviate from GTO, right? Game 3 optimal is for when you think your opponents are playing very well. If they're playing poorly, deviate from that to win more money. And then now I'll give you a total opposite example. Let's say that you think the small blind and the big blind are both going to call you 80% of the time. In that case, you would still want to widen your button opening range because their ranges are so weak. They're so inherently weak that you'll be able to soak up so much money post-flop that it doesn't really matter what you're opening with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was thinking about that last night. In my game, small blind, big blind, it's like they're easily calling with 80% of the time or more even. And I'm like, well, I thought to myself, I need to ask if it's right to open up my range or if I should narrow it.
Right. So this is like one of the biggest misconceptions that small stake coaches have. Like you'll see these guys and they're pretty good 2-5 coaches, but they'll go, oh, so if the big blind is defending too wide, you need to tighten up that range. It's the total opposite. You should widen that range, c-bet more often, fire the turn more often, fire the river more often. Because like if somebody's defending 80% of the time, that range includes hands like Queen 4 offsuit, 10-7 offsuit, 9-3 suited, right?
Mm-hmm.
How often do those hands flop a pair that they want to call 3 bets with? How often does that happen? Like such a small percentage of the time. So actually, you should actually widen your pre-flop opening range and then increase your barreling frequencies and soak up all of that dead money, right? If your opponent's range is too wide, there's nothing that he can do to fight back against you.
Unless you notice the guy is, if he's calling the 80% of the time from small blind, big blind, or even after limping, if he's calling after limping every time, I've noticed that players against me, they'll call me like super wide on the river. I'm talking like third pair, fourth pair. I'm fired 3 bullets, and it's like against certain players, I need to recognize who's willing to call down light against me and who. Because you had said if they're calling that wide, then you need to fire more on the flop, the turn, and the river, but not if they're going to call you down with like fourth pair.
Well, okay, so after I'm done coaching with you, I might be able to change your perspective on that because I utilize the overbet much more often than anybody that you know.
Yeah, I saw the overbet on Poker Snowy. I'm like, what is this overbet thing? And it was throwing me through a loop when Snowy was overbetting me. So yeah, I'd like to go over that, in a future session or something.
Oh no, we'll get into it today a little bit. Like basically, I didn't start adding the overbet to my game until I started messing around with Snowy and I started messing around with Gtorb and PO Solver, and like those are 2 advanced programs that you would probably never need to use, but I use them just a little bit. Basically, like this artificial intelligence, it plays a game with no rules, right? It doesn't have any preconceived notions like humans do. So it will do anything it thinks necessary to win. And like that's so strong, And the other thing is that it's fearless and it has no psychological attachment to money and it has no ego, right? And what we've discovered from artificial intelligence is that the overbet is being underutilized on all levels. There are even cases where you can overbet the turn and it's optimal. And that's something that like really blew my mind when I first started studying this stuff. But now I'll show you a couple spots either today or early next session where it makes sense to overbet the turn and it'll really change your perspective on certain things. So just keep an open mind as far as that goes. Now, you've got this other stuff too, so just constantly review this. Make sure you take a look at this article at least once a month, and just uh, consider these factors when it limps to you pre-flop. Consider these factors as well. Isolation ranges, huge. Pre-flop initiative, all this stuff. Just make sure that you're constantly reviewing this and try and burn it into your mind so that it forces you to slow down and just consider these factors. That's the number one thing that I could tell you. Now, second thing is use Poker Cruncher more often because it is just a gold mine. So I want to fire this up. Have you seen my Poker Cruncher training video?
I have not.
Okay, so let me see here. So I did this on my own, and I was never expecting to get like any sort of recognition at all. The developer of Poker Cruncher liked it so much that he put it on the homepage of his website. So now this video is like their official Poker Cruncher training video, which I never expected. And then he also emailed me, and he's like, "How many students have you coached using Poker Cruncher?" And I said like 150, 200. And he said, "Are there any recurring themes of things that they didn't like about it?" And I said, "Yeah, they don't like holding the command key to have to add all those boxes. You could fix that." And there were a couple other things about the user interface that he went in there and fixed. So now all of the Poker Cruncher applications are updating to the new settings, and I thought that was really cool because
that is cool.
I was never expecting that. But anyway.
I've done some stuff like that in real estate where I publish on a blog and I had a developer of the software. So it's just cool to get recognition when you're like putting that content out there.
Yeah, I mean, I was legitimately putting it out there and expecting like maybe 200 people to watch it. Mostly people that I was coaching, and then it kind of blew up, and now it's getting a ton of views. So I'm happy with it. Anyway, I want to get back to something real quick before I let you go. After this session, make sure that you bookmark that Poker News thing that I sent you, and then also be sure to watch the Poker Cruncher tutorial. It's 40 minutes, and you'll just learn a ton, and it will prepare you so much for next session. Next session, we're going to have Poker Snowy all fired up, and we're just going to do a hand history review. I'm going to record all of it, and you're going to learn more than you've learned in probably all the time that you've spent studying poker on your own. Next session will be huge, but in the meantime, make sure you watch this Poker Cruncher tutorial. It deals a lot with fold equity, and you brought up feeling uncomfortable c-betting or firing turns or whatever because now people are starting to fight back a little bit more.
Yeah,
they're not like those guys. I remember like 5 years ago, the board would come like Jack 5 deuce, and people would check fold sixes to you.
Yeah,
and now that would just be like heresy.
They're like calling flop turn river against me.
Right, exactly. So like poker has changed, it has evolved, but the framework remains the same. Okay, there are really only 5 formulas that are in play on every decision that you're making post flop. You've got pot equity, so the odds of you having the best hand or the odds of you improving to the best hand. You've got fold equity, how much you stand to profit if you get your opponent to fold, how often does he need to fold for you to break even. You've got pot odds, implied odds, and minimum defense frequency, right? Minimum defense frequency is something that you probably haven't heard of. That's probably a newer concept, right?
That's the only thing I've heard of out of those 5.
Right, so I'll give you just like a very simple scenario. Let's just do like a toy game, right? You're familiar with toy games like Bill Chen uses them in the mathematics of poker. If you've taken any game theory classes at all in college, like they use those all the time. Like let's say you're on the river, right? And
math is my weakness, just a warning. And that's why I see these poker. When you said you need to download Poker Cruncher, I was like, oh, I see these like percentages and equities and charts. And
it's scary. I realized
verbal, but math and science. Not
I realized that at face value, it looks really scary. You're like, what do all of these buttons do on Poker Cruncher, right? But after you watch that tutorial, it'll be like, wow, that was actually really docile.
Okay.
And you'll learn a ton, and it'll be like one of your number one resources. So you'll be so happy that you have that on your laptop, and I promise you, it's the best $30 you could possibly spend. So um, basically, like let's go back to that toy gaming example and say that you're on the river, and the pot is $100, and your opponent checks to you. You have no chance of winning at showdown, um, and you decide to bet $100, right? So you can either, you have two options. You can move all in for $100, or you can check. You elect to move all in, right? At that point, you're risking your $100 to win the $100 in the pot, right? So you're risking 100 to win 100, meaning that you need your opponent to fold half of the time to break even, right? If you bluff all in and lose the first time, you lose $100. If you move all in and win the pot the second time, you win the $100 pot, and at that point you've broken even after two outcomes, right? Let's switch it up a little bit and say you're betting half the pot now. So the pot is $100. Your opponent checks to you. You have no chance of winning at showdown. You move all in for $50, right? At that point, you're risking 50 to win 100. So you could move all in the first time, lose, you're down $50. You could move all in the second time, lose, you're down $100. You could move all in the third time and win the pot, and you would break even after 3 attempts. So what do we learn from that? We learned that you only need your opponent to fold a third of the time to break even when you're betting half of the pot. Okay, and that's a very important concept. Never forget that. So everything in poker is kind of is asymmetric, meaning that you either stand to win more or stand to lose more than you stand to lose or gain. So it's everything is asymmetric, and so when you're bluffing, you don't need your opponent to fold half of the time. A lot of times you don't even need them to fold 40% of the time. If you can get them to fold a third of the time, you can break even. The same thing goes with pot odds, right? If somebody moves all in on the river for $50, you're into a $100 pot, you're getting 3-1, right? You need to risk $50 to call in order to win $150. At that point, if you win 1 in 4 times, you're breaking even, right? So you don't need to win half the time. You don't even need to win a third of the time. If you're correct 25% of the time, you break even. So the best players in the world it appears that they're consistently making mistakes, but they're not. It's because they're using the mathematical framework within poker to win, right? They don't have to be right 100% of the time. So there's a third factor that goes into all of this that most people fail to forget, and it's that if you're moving all in for half the pot and you need your opponent to fold a third of the time to break even, how often does he have to defend to prevent you from being able to bluff with any 2 cards? That's minimum defense frequency. Okay? So if you need your opponent to fold a third of the time to break even, that means that he needs to be defending at least 2/3 of the time to prevent you from bluffing with any 2 cards. Do you follow that?
Say that again.
So the pot is $100, right? Your opponent checks to you. There's no way that you can win. You have the nut low. You move all in for $50, right? At that point, you need your opponent to fold 1/3 of the time, or 33% of the time, for you to break even, right? So you could bluff 50, lose, bluff 50, lose. You're down 100. You bluff a third time and win the $100 pot. You've broken even after 3 attempts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you know that your opponent needs to fold 33% of the time for you to break even, that means that there's an opposite side of that equation. He has to be calling you at least 2/3 of the time to prevent you from being able to bluff with any 2 cards, right? So let's say that he was only calling you half the time. That would mean that he's folding the other half of the time, and you would be profiting by bluffing with any 2 cards in that spot.